Goulash is one of the most popular stews in the world, and I love it. But last month when I was in Hungary, I learned that the true goulash is not a stew, but rather a soup, like this traditional bogrács gulyás, or cauldron goulash. So thank you to Ama Waterways for sponsoring this video as we make traditional Hungarian goulash, this time on Tasting History. So last month I did a river cruise with Ama Waterways, and we ended up in Budapest, Hungary. And one of the first things I wanted to do when I got there was try some goulash. And while I did try several versions, each more delicious than the last, they were all soups, rather than the stew that here in America we usually refer to as goulash. Over there they call it pörkölt. Now when deciding on a recipe to use for a traditional goulash, I was torn. I looked at a lot of 19th century recipes like this one from 1835, which is for goulash meat. 2 pounds of good meat are cut into 4 square pieces, and this is put into a pot with a pint of water, 3 onions, caraway seeds, and salt, where it must boil for 4 hours. If the liquid boils off, then water can be added. And this nourishing dish is usually served with boiled potatoes. Pretty basic, but it does sound delicious, though it is missing a key ingredient in Hungarian cuisine today, which is paprika. There was a Capuchin friar named Ubaldis, who once wrote of Hungary, "The spice of their food is some sort of red beast called paprika. It certainly bites like the devil." Also, because I asked myself this same question, yes, Capuchin monkeys are named after the Capuchin friars. The friars used to wear these brown robes and brown hoods, and when the Portuguese went to the Americas and saw the monkeys, they thought that it looked like the friars with their hoods down. Anyway, that is not germane. Back to the goulash. This recipe from 1835 seemed just a little too simple, so I wanted to find one that used paprika, but I had to look toward the later 19th century to find one. This led me to a recipe from Károly Gundel, a Budapest restaurateur at the turn of the 20th century. Now his recipe for bogrács gulyás, or cauldron goulash, actually is from the late 19th century, but he didn't write it down until 1934. And it's very similar to that 1835 recipe, except that it includes paprika and some vegetables. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 2 1/4 pound or 1 kilogram of beef. He suggests using beef shin, blade, or neck. These are not the most common cuts, but they are the best because they are high in collagen. But anything that is high in collagen will be good for goulash. Then 5 tablespoons or 80 grams of lard, 1 3/4 cup or 300 grams of diced onion, 4 teaspoons or 20 grams of sweet paprika. This is the most common version of paprika in Hungary. It's not spicy at all. It's flavorful, but it's not spicy, hence the name sweet paprika. Then 4 teaspoons of salt, a half teaspoon of caraway seeds, 2 cloves of garlic, 2 1/4 pound or 1 kilogram of potato, 1 green bell pepper, 1 small fresh tomato, and about a liter of beef stock. So first melt the lard in a pot over medium-high heat, then add the onions, making sure they get well coated in the grease. Then reduce the heat to medium-low and cook them for about 30 minutes, moving them around occasionally so they don't burn. And don't be tempted to raise the temperature and make this go faster. It should take about 30 minutes. The whole thing with goulash is low and slow. Then once the onions are a golden yellow, take the pot off the heat and add the paprika, quickly stirring it into the onion. And it is important to take it off the heat here because the paprika can burn and turn bitter. But once it's added to the onion, you can set it back over the heat and add the meat and the salt and mix everything together. Then you can raise the heat just a bit and let the meat start to brown and release its juices. Here, Gundel says that you should let the meat cook slowly, stirring occasionally until most of the liquid has evaporated. And that's one reason why it's important to have a high collagen meat, because if you use something that doesn't have a lot, then it will just become tough during this cooking process. And the liquid won't completely evaporate, but it will thicken up after about a half an hour. At that point, you can add the caraway seeds, the minced garlic, and just enough cold water so as not to cover the meat. You want to braise the meat and not boil it. Then set the lid on the pot, reduce the heat to low, and let it cook for another hour at least. While it cooks, chop the potatoes, green pepper, and tomato into small pieces, and then when the meat is nice and tender, add the vegetables and stir everything together, and then add some of the beef stock, but only enough so that you can see it through the vegetables and not so much that they're covered. Let it return to a simmer and set the lid on and let it continue to cook until the potato is fully cooked after about 45 minutes to an hour. This is also a good time to give it a taste and see if you want to add some more salt or more paprika. And it's usually going to need more paprika. I've seen recipes today that use 4 to 6 times as much as this recipe calls for. Most of the ones that I had over in Hungary, lots of paprika, so go ahead and add more. Though except for the amount of paprika being used, I do feel that this recipe is very similar to the first goulash that I had on my first night in Budapest. Frankly, the entire trip to Budapest and elsewhere was filled with food, which is why I chose to partner with AMA Waterways for this trip and the ones that I'm going to be leading in October and next February. They are luxurious, the ship is beautiful, the service is impeccable, and they have a focus both on food and history. I had never done a river cruise, and I have to say, it's a wonderful way to see Europe. You get to see a lot of different places without having to change hotels. Basically, you unpack once, and that's it. And sailing along the Danube, you get to see views that you would never get to see from land, the view of the Budapest Parliament being a highlight for me. Now, there are a few suites left for the October cruise down the Danube, but I enjoyed this experience so much that I decided to add another cruise, not on the Danube, but on the Nile. So next February, I am going to be hosting a river cruise down the Nile in Egypt. And we will have an Egyptologist with us the entire time. So if you want to hang out with me on a boat and learn about food and history in Egypt next February, I will put a link to that in the description. And just as there will be food history on that cruise, there was food history on this one as well when I got to Budapest and learned the history of goulash. The history of goulash, or gulyás in Hungarian, is the history of Hungary. Many of the developments of the dish mirror important periods in Hungarian history. And it begins in the 9th century. This is when a people from the Ural Mountains came to the Carpathian Basin along the Danube and began to settle the area. The people were known as the Magyars, and even today, Hungarians refer to themselves not as Hungarians, but as Magyars, and their word for Hungary is Magyarország, or Land of the Magyars. Many of these early settlers were itinerant herdsmen known as gulyás, and as they watched over their flocks and their herds, they would eat some of the animals, and so they would boil the meat or stew the meat in a large kettle or cauldron known as a bograch. And they would stew the meat down until there was no liquid left, and they would eat what they wanted, and then the rest they would dry out in the sun, similar to the way that the Plains Indians of North America made pemmican with bison meat. Then whenever the Magyar gulyás wanted another meal, instead of having to slaughter another animal, they could just take some of that dried meat, put it back in the cauldron, add some water and some vegetables, and have a brand new soup. And it is the portable nature of this early meat, gulyás meat, that is thought to have allowed it to spread so quickly into places like modern-day Austria, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Now, of course, they didn't write any of this down, so it is all a theory. A good theory, but it is a theory. What isn't a theory is the first big evolutionary step in the dish of gulyás, and that came in 1476, when the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, Matthias I, married Beatrice of Naples. Now, by all accounts being those of Antonio Bonfini, who was the court historian in King Matthias's court, the Hungarian cuisine was pretty basic and was in dire need of some Italian influence. Now, Bonfini, as his name would suggest, was Italian, so take his opinion with a grain of salt. So Matthias I, perhaps the greatest monarch in Hungarian history, marries Beatrice, who is coming from Renaissance Italy, and so her new life in Hungary, she was not impressed with the food or a lot of other things, and she made this known, as did some of the people that came with her. One of them wrote of the Hungarians that they don't eat like us, each one with a plate, but all from the same plate. And to take the pieces, they do not serve themselves with forks, as is done with us in Italy, but with their fingers and a slab of bread. Well, Antonio Bonfini, writing that the king wanted to make his new wife happy, improved his board and manner of life, introduced sumptuous banquets, disdaining humility at home, and beautified dining rooms. He grafted Italian manners onto Scythian ones. The king also imported Italian chefs who brought Italian ingredients, though many of these ingredients were actually sent by Beatrice's sister, Leonora, the Duchess of Ferrara. She sent Italian styles of cheese and olives, cumin, garlic, and most important when it comes to goulash, onions. Now, Hungary had had wild onions growing for ages, and they probably used them in the soup, but the big, fat, white, sweet onion of Italian cuisine made its way to Hungary during this period, and that is what would become a staple ingredient of Hungarian goulash. Now, the next evolutionary step, the next ingredient introduced into Hungary came not with the Italians, but with the Ottomans. In 1526, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent defeated a Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs, and by 1541 they controlled the capital city of Buda, half of what is now Budapest. And for the next 150 years, Hungary was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it is during this time that numerous ingredients enter Hungarian cuisine. Probably most famous would be coffee or paprika, and that's the one that's important for goulash. Though actually it wasn't paprika, it was just the pepper. The pepper had originated, of course, in the Americas and had come over with the Spanish and then entered Italian cuisine and made its way east into Ottoman cuisine. And then they brought it up to Hungary, but they had to bring them dried since they had to travel quite some ways, and the Hungarians took these dried peppers, ground them into a powder, and that powder was paprika. It wasn't long before they started taking the seeds and growing the peppers themselves, though it was mostly amongst the common people. Now, it doesn't seem that they were actually using paprika in goulash at the time, at least not in the recipes that were being written down. It's likely that some people were putting it in there, but it wasn't in the recipes. Also, a note on paprika. Paprika is made simply from crushing up dried red peppers. Some of them are quite hot and some of them are very, very mild, even sweet. But by most accounts, the early peppers were just hot. They were quite spicy, and those were the ones that the common people were eating, and the aristocracy didn't like it. It was too hot. But that changed in 1859 when two brothers from the city of Szeged, János and Balázs Pálffy, invented a machine to remove the white ribs and seeds from the pepper, thus creating what was known as noble sweet paprika, which is what ended up becoming the more popular version in Hungary, especially when making goulash. Though as I understand it, today when making the sweet paprika, they have cultivated a pepper to be mild and sweet. So they can just crush it down, dry it up, crush it down, and there is your sweet paprika. Now, just as paprika was finding many different variations during this period, so too was goulash itself. It was no longer just the stewed meat of the Magyar herdsman. It could refer to any number of soups or meat dishes. Some of the soups didn't even have meat. There is a bean goulash that kind of develops around this time. Sometimes they're seafood goulashes. Also, it was now all over Central and Southern Europe. Different cuisines from Italian to Austrian, German, Czech, they all had their own versions of goulash developing. For instance, in the Czech Republic, they typically use the hotter version of paprika rather than the sweet paprika of Hungarian goulash. Now, the person who actually deserves probably the most credit for spreading goulash around the globe was not a Hungarian at all, but a Frenchman. In 1879, the eminent chef Auguste Escoffier served a goulash à la hongroise, Hungarian goulash, at a restaurant in Monte Carlo, and then he introduced the recipe in his seminal work, Le Guide Culinaire, which became the blueprint for fine dining for the first half of the 20th century in most of Europe and America. And it is to him that we can credit or blame the idea that goulash is a thick stew, because his recipe has very little liquid and it is more like the pulkult of Hungary. But since he was a famous chef, what he said is what most people went with. Now, there was, of course, another famous chef, a Hungarian chef, who tried to spread the gospel of Hungarian cuisine, and that is Károly Gundel, whose recipe we're working from today. He had a restaurant in Budapest, but he also wrote cookbooks that spread numerous recipes for different types of Hungarian goulash soups around the world. It was also his restaurant which was the official restaurant of the Hungarian Pavilion at the 1939 New York World's Fair, and the New York Times touted that the Gundel restaurant is a bigger, better publicity from Budapest than a boatload of tourist brochures. And perhaps if Hungary hadn't come under the control of the Germans and then the Soviets in the 1940s and early 50s, he could have continued his crusade to let the world know that goulash is a soup and not a stew, but alas, that is not what happened. That said, there was another Hungarian-born restaurateur who did make it his goal to spread the word about true Hungarian cuisine. His name, after changing it when he emigrated to the US following World War II, was George Lang, and he led an incredibly interesting life and had a wonderful sense of humor, as can be seen by the title of his autobiography, Nobody Knows the Truffles I've Seen. In addition to owning New York City's famous Café des Artistes, he wrote a work called The Cuisine of Hungary, where he attempted to teach people how to make a proper Hungarian goulash, saying that while there are many ways to make goulash, one should never Frenchify it with wine, never Germanize it with brown sauce, and even a culinary pope, if there were one, would not be considered infallible and allowed to put sour cream into goulash. And since I don't want to incur the wrath of the late George Lang, I will do none of those things, but I will stick to the recipe given to us by Károly Gundel. So once the potato is fully cooked, he says that you can add an egg pasta known as tipetka, which are just little pieces of pinched pasta made of egg and flour. It actually means to pinch, tipetka. But more traditionally, all you do is add some more water or beef stock until you have a nice soup consistency and then serve. And here we are. Traditional Hungarian goulash. Smells absolutely wonderful, and I can smell the paprika. I did add some more, but I think I could have even added more because it's not the deep red that that you'll see in Hungary today. But it is somewhat red. There's also a nice sheen of fat on the top. Here we go. It's so good. I mean, it's so simple, but man, that is so good. Also, the beef, you gotta find something. I mean, I guess you could use like chuck or something like that that just will break down over a long cooking time, because it does cook for a while, but it's not tough, it's just tender. It's so good. Like I said, more paprika, great. As is, great. Yeah, I think that you're doing yourself a real disservice if you don't make this. It's not that hard. It takes a while, but it's absolutely delicious. And if you do go to Budapest, definitely order this and the pörkölt. You'll try two different things. Fantastic. If you want to join me on the Danube, like I said, there are a few suites left, I think, or in Egypt next February, sailing down the Nile, then I'll put a link to that in the description, and I will see you next time on Taste. For as long as people have been drinking, they have been drinking to excess, and that means that we've had thousands of years to come up with lots of cures for the hangover, like this 10th century recipe for kishkia from Baghdad. So thank you to Masterclass for sponsoring this video as we try to cure that New Year's hangover, this time on Tasting History. If you've ever had a hangover, you'll know that it sucks, and in that moment, you will grasp at absolutely anything to get rid of that feeling, whether it be a mimosa or Bloody Mary, a hair of the dog, if you will, or, like I usually do, a lot of greasy food, a burger and fries. And the greasy food, well, that's not a new thing. Back in the 10th century, the Baghdadi author Ibn Zayar al-Warraq wrote a cookbook, Kitab al-Tabikh, or the Book of Dishes. And in it, along with a lot of recipes for how to make different alcoholic drinks, he includes a recipe for a stew called kishkia, named after its main ingredient, kishk. Kishk has balanced properties. It digests fast and is good for treating people with hangovers. Kishk, sometimes called kashk, is still a popular ingredient today in the Middle East, and it can vary wildly from place to place. But in this cookbook, it talks about a type that is made of fermented barley and whey, and then it's left to dry and crumbled up into a sort of powder. It does actually mention several types of kishk to be used in this recipe, but it's not totally clear what those were, and I was only able to find one type, so that's what I'm using. I'm using a cup of this powdered kashk, which I'm whisking into 2 cups of verjuice, which is the juice of unripe grapes and has sort of a sour and vinegary flavor. So between that and the kishk, I'm going to guess this dish is going to have a rather sour fermented flavor, which is probably good for kicking a medieval hangover. Now, the recipe is rather long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the translation from Nawal Nasrallah's Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen is surprisingly specific in the quantities of most of the ingredients that are used. It starts off by saying, wash 3 rattles of meat and put it in a pot. Add a half rattle chopped onion, a quarter rattle fresh herbs, a handful of chickpeas, 1 piece galangal, and a quarter rattle olive oil. Pour water to submerge the ingredients in the pot. Let the pot cook until meat is almost done. Add any of the seasonal green vegetables and a little chard. A rattle at the time was roughly 1 pound, so it's just cool to cook from a recipe that's this old and yet have exact measurements to work with. So for this full recipe, what you'll need is 3 pounds of lamb or other meat with the bone, 1 medium onion sliced, a quarter cup of diced onion, a quarter pound of fresh herbs. It's not specific in what herbs to be used, so I'm using a mixture of coriander, thyme, parsley, basil, and oregano, all of which would have been available in the region. Also, a quarter pound of herbs is a lot of herbs. A half cup of chickpeas, a 2-inch long piece of galangal. Galangal is in the same family as ginger, and it has a similar flavor, though I find it to be a little bit more earthy and citrusy, and you can usually find it at an Asian grocery store. A half cup of olive oil, 1 head of green chard chopped fine, the same amount of another green vegetable like spinach, 1 teaspoon of cumin, 1.5 teaspoons of cassia or cinnamon, a half teaspoon of cloves, and 1 teaspoon of spikenard. Spikenard is an aromatic that for thousands of years has been used in perfumes and balms, but it can also be used culinarily. You just can buy it dried online. And now, even though I feel like the main flavor profile of this dish is going to be kind of sour with the kishk and the verjuice, all of these different aromatics and the ton of herbs that are in it, I think it's going to give it a really complex flavor profile. So even 1,000 years ago, people knew how to create a complex palette of flavors. Now, I may not be an Alice Waters or a Gordon Ramsay, but I do know enough about cooking to show you how to make this 10th century kishkia. So chop the meat into large chunks and put them with the bone into a large pot along with the fresh herbs, the chickpeas, the galangal, and the olive oil. And mix this all together and then add enough water to cover the ingredients. Oh, and also add the sliced onion. I forgot that, but you can add it now. Don't add the diced onion though. Set this over medium heat and bring it to a simmer and then cover the pot and let it cook for about an hour or until the meat is nice and tender. Once the meat is ready, add in the chard and the spinach. And as I often do, I have overestimated the size of my pot or underestimated the size of the dish, and so I had to switch from the smaller pot to the larger pot, and one of these days I'll just learn to always start with the larger pot. With the greens in the pot though, you can let it stew for another 15 or 20 minutes, and this is a good time to whisk your kishk into the verjuice because it does take 10 or 15 minutes to really kind of fully dissolve and it thickens up, and then you can add that to the stew as well. Stir it in and let it cook for another 20 minutes, then add in the cumin and the cassia along with the diced onion. Give it another 10 minutes and finally stir in the cloves and the spikenard. At this point, the recipe says to stop fueling the fire, let the pot simmer and rest on the remaining heat, then take it down, God willing. Of course, I'm not cooking this on a wood-fired stove, so there is no way to stop fueling the fire, so I'm just turning it on very low and letting it simmer for about an hour. Now, in this cookbook, following the recipe, there is something that I feel most cookbooks today are sorely missing, and that is a poem about the dish itself. And it was written by a 9th century prince who was also a poet and a singer and a composer, and it is all about kishkia, the nourishing dish to have when in the gripes of a hangover one craves some food. If sakbaja is missed, kishk may replace it when a sour dish he must have. Made with shoulder cuts of lamb and of tail fat an equal amount is put. Juice of sour grapes poured to cover will make it good and a dish to savor. Its pale hue shimmers like her contour flickering through her sheer gown. Having eating it intoxicated one will be all anew, and the hangover will itself renew. So yes, while there were times in history where drinking in the Islamic world was completely forbidden and they weren't doing it, the recipe and other recipes for alcohol in this book and this poem show that that was not always the case. Kind of depended on whoever was in charge, how strict they were. Drinking and hangovers were a rather daily occurrence for most of history, and so along with this recipe for kishkia, the ancients have left us several other remedies to save your poor aching head. In the ancient Greek work De Hypnosophiste, the author Athenaeus quotes the even more ancient poet Alexis, saying, "If the headache only came to us before we drink to intoxication, no one would ever indulge himself in wine immoderately. But as it is, foreseeing not that punishment for drunkenness will come, we readily give ourselves over to drinking unmixed cups." Unmixed cups being a wine that wasn't watered down, and so much more likely to go to your head all the quicker. And if hangovers were such a concern even in Alexis's day, then I ask, what were some of the cures that they had floating around? Well, one of the oldest comes from a Babylonian tablet, which says, "If a man has taken strong wine, and his head is affected, and he forgets his words, and his speech becomes confused, take licorice, beans, oleander, and so forth, with oil and wine before the approach of sunset, and in the morning before sunrise. And before anyone has kissed him, let him take it, and he will recover." So even then, over 3,000 years ago, they suggest something oily and a bit of the hair of the dog that bit you, that being a little bit more wine. They also suggest a little oleander, which can be poisonous, so don't try that one at home. Also, I would not try the remedy for a hangover headache that Pliny the Elder gives us. Headache can be relieved when the patient drinks the water left in a trough after an ox or ass has been drinking there, and should we care to believe it, by the male organ of a fox worn round the head. Thank God for aspirin. Honestly, sometimes I feel like Pliny the Elder is just punking us. Like, does he really believe these things that he writes down? I kind of think not. Though he does actually give us, instead of a remedy, this is more of something so you just don't get a hangover headache in the first place, and that is to not drink wine that has been treated with resin. The ancient Romans would often add a type of resin to their wine to act as a bit of a preservative. But Pliny warns that new wine seasoned with resin is good for nobody, causing headache and fits of giddiness. For this reason, it has been named crapula. Crapula is the name of the resin that they would add, and it got its name from the Latin word for drunkenness, crapula. And after drinking some of this resin, the next morning you feel like crapola, which, oddly enough, those two words are not linked etymologically. Now, as we move on from the ancient world into the medieval world, many of the remedies are more similar to the ones that we would see today. Like, instead of drinking out of a trough that a donkey drank out of, in the Islamic world it was suggested to drink lemonade with mint or quince along with your wine. This would just stop the hangover from even forming. Essentially, hydrate while you're drinking and you won't feel so bad in the morning, and I have found that to be absolutely true. And should you forget to hydrate, then just drink some cold water. You need to know that drinking cold water first thing in the morning is recommended only for people suffering from acute heat, fevers, and hangovers. However, they should avoid drinking it in one big gulp. Rather, they need to have it in several small doses and breathe deeply between one dose and the other. Well, that's just good advice. As is the advice given by the 14th century English royal physician John Gadsden, though his writing style is a bit more specific, shall we say. He talks about drinking a pomegranate wine that is flavored with some vinegar and sugar. But if anyone have drunk too much, if it be a man, the testicles should be washed with salt and vinegar, and if it be a woman, the breasts. Also, let them eat the leaf or the stalk or the juice of a cabbage with sugar. I mean, essentially, he's just saying have a good wash and eat some vegetables, and that's a good way to kick a hangover. But his description is so specific. Now, if you go online and look up medieval hangover cures, you'll find a bunch that are just crazy. But I don't think that many of them are actually true. I searched for primary sources on a lot of them, and I couldn't find anything. They just pointed to other places on the internet where they were just repeating exactly what they had read on other places on the internet. Like one that suggests that if you have a hangover, the medieval people thought you would eat raw eel and it would come to life in your belly and drink the remaining alcohol. I mean, paints quite a picture, but they didn't think that. That said, there was an actual idea that eels could be used if you tended to overindulge in alcohol in the first place, but it wasn't by eating them. This idea originated around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, but then it was written down again in the 17th century by Nicholas Culpeper, who wrote that eels being put into wine or beer and suffered to die in it, he that drinks it will never endure that sort of liquor again. And I mean, I guess that has to be true. If you want to drink some beer, then take some eels and drown it in that beer, and you won't want to drink that beer anymore. Makes perfect sense to me. And really, perhaps they should have used this prophylactic. Around the same time in Russia, there was a German scholar, Adam Olearius, who traveled to Russia in the 1630s and wrote that everyone in society was constantly drunk. Both secular and ecclesiastical, high and low, men and women, young and old. None of them anywhere, any time, or under any circumstance let pass any opportunity to have a draught or a drinking bout. This surely led to many, many hangovers. But, just like the people of 10th century Baghdad, they had a remedy for that. The Russians prepare a special dish when they have a hangover. They cut cold baked lamb into small pieces, like cubes but thinner and broader, mix them with peppers and cucumbers, similarly cut, and pour over them a mixture of equal parts of vinegar and cucumber juice. They eat this with a spoon, and afterwards, a drink tastes good again. Lamb meat, green veggies, and vinegar. It is very much the same kind of dish as the one that we're making today, minus the kishk, of course. So it must have worked just as well as my greasy burger and fries. Now, one remedy that personally I have never subscribed to is a hair of the dog, but clearly it works because people have been talking about it for centuries, for millennia. Having a little bit of the drink that gave you the hangover will actually cure the hangover. Though originally, of course, hair of the dog wasn't referring to a hangover and alcohol, but rather to rabies and an actual hair of a dog. In the 1st century, Pliny the Elder once again suggested that when a person has been bitten by a mad dog, he may be preserved from hydrophobia by inserting in the wound ashes of hairs from the tail of the dog that inflicted the bite. But even though that's how the phrase got started, it came to refer to alleviating hangovers at least by the 16th century. In the work Gargantua and Pantagruel by Rabelais, he talks about a man who drinks an inordinate amount of wine, so much so that he is elevated by Bacchic enthusiasm. That is, he got very drunk. And so the character of Friar John asks what a pox ails the fellow? What o devil has he swallowed? His eyes roll in his loggerhead just for the world like a dying goat's. Will nobody be so kind as to cram some dog's bur down the poor cur's gullet? Will he take a hair of the same dog? This is, of course, the theory behind the Morning Bloody Mary as a restorative, though there are actually some liquors that were made specifically to cure ailments like hangovers. For example, the Aperitif Fernet Branca was created in Milan in 1845 as a bit of a cure-all. It could rid you of worms or even cholera, but perhaps less impressive, but more practical, it was considered a cure or preventative for a hangover. Today, the company that produces it has dropped the claims that it will get rid of worms or cure cholera, but they have held on to the claim that it will prevent or fix a hangover. For me, one of the least appetizing hangover cures has to be one of the most recent, and that is the prairie oyster, where it's been called that here in the US since at least the early 20th century. But my favorite description actually comes from Jeeves of P.G. Wodehouse's Jeeves and Wooster stories. Basically, when Jeeves first encounters Bertie Wooster, Bertie is trying to find a valet, kind of a butler sort of thing, and Jeeves is there to get a job. But Bertie has a terrible hangover, and Jeeves secures his job by making him up what essentially is a prairie oyster. It is a little preparation of my own invention. It is the Worcester sauce that gives it its color. The raw egg makes it nutritious. The red pepper gives it its bite. Gentlemen have told me that they have found it extremely invigorating after a late evening. I find the very thought of one of these drinks even more nauseating than the hangover itself. But a lot of people swear by them, so who knows? For me, I'm going to stick to my greasy burger and fries unless I am won over by this 10th century recipe for kishkia, which should be about ready to eat. And here we are, kishkia from 10th century Baghdad. So I'm not going to lie, it's not the prettiest dish. It is what it is. It wasn't that pretty, and then I added the kishk, and it made it less pretty because it kind of makes it like this pale thing, and it has this shimmering layer of oil on the top, which in the poem he said reminded him of like a sheer dress, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yet, it smells quite good, so let's give it a try. Doesn't look good, but it actually tastes really good. It is really complicated. The flavors just keep coming, one after another. So the first thing that you do get, you get that lamb flavor. If you don't like lamb, you won't like this. But then you do get that kind of sourness from the verjuice and the kishk. And I don't love that, but then that is pushed aside in favor of the greens and the different spices that are in there, and that's really the flavor that you're left with. What I really enjoy is the amalgam of textures. You have the meat, but then you also have some of the onion that has been in there for so long that it's now just kind of mush, but then also some onion that's only been cooking for half the time. So it's still got a little crunch. You've got a little crunch from the greens, but some of them have completely fallen apart. The chickpeas have their distinct texture. Really interesting. I can see why, just like any stew, if you're not feeling so great, this kind of thing, warm you up, it would feel good. Yeah. I'm gonna stick with my burger and fries, partly because it's just easier, and I like burger and fries, but I can see why this definitely had its place. I do think that this would have to be made the day before you plan on drinking because, one, it would make the flavors really kind of come together more, but also, nobody's gonna feel like making an hours-long stew with a hangover, so you gotta think ahead. For me, I just try not to drink so much anymore, because I don't like a hangover, so a couple drinks and I'm good to go, and that's called being 41. So have a happy new year, don't drink too much, and I will see you next. Today the term hobo is usually used in a derogatory manner, but that was not always the case. And during the period between the American Civil War and the end of the Great Depression, hobos were a particular and important group of migrant workers that crisscrossed the country on freight trains, often cooking outdoors. And their most famous recipe was something called mulligan stew, which I am recreating today using a recipe from the Great Depression. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we make a meal for the hard times. This time on Tasting History. So I gotta admit, before researching this video, I had never really thought about the term hobo or the subculture that were hobos in the late 19th and early 20th century, but then I read this book called Riding the Rail, Teenagers on the Move During the Great Depression. And I quickly had a whole new appreciation for a very large group of people who, by choice or by circumstance, played a big role in that period of America's history. What I found really surprising was how cohesive and organized this group of people were at the time. In 1889, they held a national convention. They were often unionized. They had their own newspaper and colleges, and they lived together in groups called jungles. And that is where we first hear about this dish called mulligan stew. In 1923, it was written of the hobo that he not only cooks his own food, but has even invented dishes that are peculiar to jungle life. Chief among these is mulligan stew, a throw together of vegetables and meat. And a book of hobo songs written in 1930 claims that mulligan is the hobo's one contribution to American victualry. Its ingredients are seldom the same. Any and all vegetables and meats that come to hand go into its making. The hobo regards it as his national dish, and many a dead one retains a liking for it that amounts to affection. A dead one actually just meant someone who had had too much to drink. So this stew is very simple. It's basically just a beef or even just a meat and vegetable stew of any kind that was usually made in a tin pot or a can over an open fire. But the issue is that very often these people would be on the move, and so they didn't have a lot of access to fresh meat and fresh vegetables. And so it was often made with things that you could carry around with you for days or even weeks at a time. And I did find a recipe from the late Depression that is basically that. It calls for 1 medium-sized can of corned beef, minced, 1 onion, minced fine, 1 No. 2 canned peas with liquid, A number 2 can actually holds about 2.5 cups of peas in liquid, and you probably can't find that today, at least I couldn't, so a standard can today is a little bit smaller, so you need about 1.5 cans. Then 1 medium-sized bottle tomato ketchup. Again, the standard size at the time seems to be 12 ounces, and I gotta say, that is a lot of ketchup. Then 1 cup or 235 milliliters of water and salt and pepper to taste. I used about 1/4 teaspoon of salt and 1.5 teaspoons of pepper. Then the recipe just says put all the ingredients in saucepan and simmer gently over low flame for about 1 hour. The flavor improves with the length of cooking time. So it's very simple, but also kind of interesting. I mean, I don't think I've ever cooked a soup with this much or any ketchup in it, and I have never opened one of these cans of corned beef. But it's kind of fun. Comes with this little key that you just stick into the bottom and you twist around the edge and it just opens up. What's not fun is the smell and look of the corned beef inside. It smells a bit like cat food, and frankly it kind of looks like it as well. So let us hope that the cooking process is transformative. So to cook this mulligan stew, all you do is add the water and the peas with the liquid to a pot and bring it to a simmer. Then while it heats, mince the corned beef really fine and then add that to the pot along with the onion and the ketchup. Stir that in and then add in the salt and the pepper. And you can add more salt and pepper later on to taste, but I'll tell you there is a lot of salt in pretty much all of the other ingredients, so you might not really need to add any at all. Once you've added everything, lower the heat to its lowest setting and set the lid on. You want to have this at a very, very low setting because you don't want it to boil over. You just want it low enough that it's bubbling when you lift the lid. And you can give it a stir every so often, but really you just leave it be for an hour or even more. It does say that the flavor improves the longer that it cooks. And that's going to be plenty of time for me to ask you to like this video, subscribe. It really does help out the channel a lot, and it'll keep me around so I can tell you a little bit more about the history of mulligan stew, a stew that comes from a very interesting group of people. So like I said at the start, the word hobo is often used in a derogatory manner today to refer to anyone who is homeless. But it's not always been that case. It was used in a derogatory way by some, but many used it not like that at all, and it really just applied to a subset of those people. H.L. Mencken, the wonderful writer, actually wrote down a definition that can explain it a lot better than I can. He wrote, "Tramps and hobos are commonly lumped together, but in their own sight they are sharply differentiated. A hobo, or beau, is simply a migratory laborer. He may take some longish holidays, but soon or late he returns to work. A tramp never works if it can be avoided. He simply travels." This group of men, and it was mostly men at least at the start, first emerged in large numbers following the American Civil War. Many discharged veterans made their way home on freight trains, and for one reason or another, many had PTSD, but some also wrote that they had gotten used to the itinerant life of being in the Army. Many chose not to return home, and instead, they traveled the country looking for work. What's interesting is that while the lifestyle took off here in the US following the Civil War, it was not just a United States phenomenon. There was hobo culture happening in the UK, in France, in Canada, basically anywhere where there were a lot of freight trains. And it was mostly because of those freight trains that this was a very dangerous lifestyle. A lot of people got seriously injured when getting on and off of the freight cars. Sometimes they would get locked inside of the freight cars and simply starve to death or freeze to death at night, or if they happened to get in one of the refrigerated cars. One of the most dangerous ways that they would ride was something that they called riding the rods, which instead of being in the car, they would ride beneath the car right above the rails. Also, since they were technically breaking the law by riding on these freight trains, they would often get in trouble with either the law or with the train companies themselves. But even so, they were an incredibly important part of the American workforce during that period from like 1870 through the end of the Great Depression, around the early 1940s. There were many jobs which only required workers for part of the year, whether that was working on farms in the Midwest, or in the lumber camps in the Northeast and up in Canada, or the fish canneries all along the West Coast. Many of these jobs would provide housing and food during the months of employment, but then typically during the winter the work would dry up and the hobos would have to travel back to the cities where they would set up these shanty towns that they called jungles. And it was here in these shanty towns that their culture really came together. And there was a whole culture at the time. They even had their own language, and a lot of the words were written down in the 19-teens and 20s, and a lot of them had to do with food. Words like a poke-out, which was a meal wrapped in paper given out by someone at a farmhouse. And there was gump, which was chicken, pumpkin gut, bread and sausage, flat cars, which were pancakes, alligator bait was fried liver, jamoke was just coffee in a paper cup, Irish turkey was corned beef and cabbage, minister's face was a stewed pig's head, and my favorite was mule, which was raw white whiskey, and it was called mule because it gave you quite a kick. They also supposedly developed a system of symbols which they would leave on posts and fences and boxcars throughout the country, letting others know directions or if a particular area was friendly or hostile to hobos. And I say supposedly because it is unclear just how common or even truthful this system was, at least at the start, because it came from the hobos. They were the ones who told people about this system, but the fact that they told people about it makes it less secret. And most of it came to light from a single author named Leon Ray Livingston, alias A Number 1. He was the most famous hobo in the world at the beginning of the 20th century, and he wrote 12 books on his life traveling the hobo way. He romanticized the lifestyle and did share aspects of hobo culture that did exist, but then there are other things that he absolutely exaggerated or just made up. He was all about romanticizing the lifestyle and creating a mystique around being a hobo, and the hobos at the time leaned into this mystique. And this romantic version of hobo culture actually led a lot of young men to want to live this lifestyle even when circumstances didn't necessarily dictate that they needed to. And so there were approximately 700,000 hobos going throughout the United States by 1911. And with that many people, the hobo culture became more and more organized, largely due to the work of James Eads Howe, who was often known as the millionaire hobo. And it wasn't just a moniker, he was actually a millionaire. He was the heir to a vast fortune from a St. Louis family who just decided to live life as a hobo. And after some years living the life, he spent much of his time trying to figure out ways to uplift that community. He founded the International Brotherhood Welfare Association, which was a union for migrant workers, and they published a newspaper called Hobo News, which included poems and comics and articles about how to live life as a hobo, as well as news about seasonal employment and organizing unions. They also organized hobo colleges, which ran in several different cities during the winter months of unemployment. The most successful was in Chicago, and that college not only provided food and lodging, but also classes. Hobos could take classes in public speaking and law, social sciences, and even philosophy and literature. As Howe himself wrote in 1907, the object of the Welfare Brotherhood is twofold. I want to make the hobos not only better citizens, but better hobos. And I want the public to appreciate what the beat is, what his rights are, and how he should be looked upon. Now, by the mid-20s, the economy was booming, and this led to less people joining the hobo lifestyle, but there was going to be one more major upswell in the number of people living the lifestyle, and that came with the Great Depression. By the end of 1930, as more and more people were losing their jobs, hobo jungles around the country began to fill with newcomers, and one of the largest was near Grant Park in Chicago. And as it grew in size, it was dubbed Hooverville, a nod to President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the lack of action in those early days of the Great Depression. Other shantytowns around the country, whether started as hobo jungles or simply as groups of people who had newly become homeless, would take on this term of Hooverville. But when it came to hobos specifically, this period really saw a huge swell in their numbers, and with people from all walks of life. And this actually led to a lot more people living the culture and enjoying things like mulligan stew, which some of the people who had been hobos for a long time kind of took umbrage with and were kind of like, you're not doing it right. There's an article from 1934 titled, "Shucks, That Ain't Mulligan," and in it one of the newcomers describes making a mulligan stew with potatoes, onions, and carrots, which one of the old guard hobos scoffed at. "Carrots, great shades of Epicurus, what verbal crimes are committed in the name of good eating? Who ever heard of carrots in a mulligan stew? Carrots have no more place in a self-respecting mulligan stew than has Worcester sauce in a steaming cup of coffee. Any person or any newspaper that would put carrots in a mulligan stew would pour yellow mustard over a sugar-baked ham." But as much as the old-timers might want to protect their mulligan stew, there was no stopping this new boom of hobos entering their culture during the Great Depression. But it wasn't just now hobos making mulligan, it was everybody. With the romanticization of hobo culture through things like the writings of Leon Ray Livingston and the popularity of the Charlie Chaplin character, the Tramp, even those who were not living the life began to adopt aspects of the culture, including the making of mulligan stew. It's in the 30s that you start seeing a lot of mulligan stew recipes cropping up in cookbooks and in newspapers. Though these recipes were usually made with fresh beef and fresh vegetables, basically a nice beef stew. It was even eaten by some of the wealthiest citizens of New York City in 1933. The New York Daily News announced that there were 400 to sample breadline slum, just in case. Mulligan stew with rice, bread and butter, apple sauce and donuts, coffee. This 25-cent table-d'hôte menu will be spread before the guests of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt, to the Grand Duchess Marie and other members of the caviar crowd at a large and ritzy dinner party next Monday evening. And the guests can like it or lump it, because there aren't going to be any changes or additions to this menu. The dinner party promises to be one of the largest and swankiest of the year, with hundreds of our best people seated at bare wooden tables, served by Boy Scouts, and plumb fascinated by mulligan stew, known in quaint and unsparing military parlance as slum. And with that, many others who were far, far from living the hobo lifestyle jumped on the bandwagon and emulated some aspects of their culture. They would host these parties called depression parties or hobo parties or hard time socials, where they would dress up as hobos or tramps and then make food using very cheap ingredients. One depression party from 1934 announced that second and third prizes were given to those whose clothes best represented hard times. And in 1937, the Roseville Press announced that Townsend Club to hold Hard Times Pie Social. Those attending are asked to wear their old clothes. Persons who come dressed up will be fined 10 cents. When you look in the newspapers from the time, the parties were really common. Everyone was having them, and I just think that's kind of odd. It's like outside, in the real world, during this time, so many people were losing their houses and their possessions and having trouble finding work, and then here's another group of society who's like, let's dress up as these people, and it was just a form of entertainment. As for the real hobos, those many young men who had taken to the road when they couldn't find work quickly realized that the romantic fantasy sold to them in movies like the 1933 film Wild Boys of the Road was not all it was cracked up to be. Finding food was often the most difficult part of this lifestyle, and a lot of the first-hand accounts in the book Riding the Rails, it talks about people just trying to find food and how they would have to do it. Sometimes it was begging, sometimes it was stealing, or in one case of one guy, he figured out a way to make a meal by going to a diner or a cafe even when he couldn't afford to buy anything. Almost all cafes brought you a glass of water. The tables had ketchup and crackers. I'd drink some water, pour ketchup in the glass, and mix in the crackers. It helped when it was your only meal of the day. But perhaps Kingsley Davis, who was a sociologist studying this group in the 1930s, put it best when he talked about this new crop of hobos. He said, 500,000 American boys set out to look for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They found it, but instead of gold, it contained only traces of mulligan stew. Now, many of these young men were given a reprieve when they found work with the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a program which did everything from help build the state and national parks in our country to laying out many of the roads and trails. They planted trees, they restored land that had been damaged during the Dust Bowl, among so many other works programs across the country. And along with their average pay of $30 a month, they received housing, clothing, and food. So at least if they were going to have to make a mulligan stew, it would be with fresh ingredients, unlike the one that I'm about to eat right now. And here we are, mulligan stew from the Great Depression. It actually smells really good. It smells much better than I expected. So let's see how it tastes. I don't know how I feel about this. Another taste. So overall, the flavor is really nice. It's this may be the only time I've ever said this in my life. It's a little too sweet. I think the amount of ketchup that is in there, it's a lot of ketchup, and that is the dominant flavor that I'm getting. And I'm wondering, maybe the ketchup in the 1930s was not quite as sweet as we use today. I don't know. It's a little sweet, but the flavor is very nice. So I think if you backed off the ketchup and added maybe just some more canned vegetables or something, that'd actually be pretty nice. And it's hearty. The meat, the corned beef, has just disintegrated into just like little crumbles. But so you're getting that texture, but you're not really getting a lot of flavor from it. But it's not bad. No longer has the cat food flavor, smell, which is A-okay. You know, if you're really hungry and you're out on the road, this would be a good meal. So in my day, the cool thing to eat at school lunch was a Lunchable. But in 1934, it was peanut butter and tomato soup, a butter sandwich, a hermit cookie, and an apple and milk. So thank you to Wondrium for sponsoring this video as we make school lunch from the Great Depression, this time on Tasting History. So using an old menu from 1934, I'm going to put together an entire meal for a school lunch today, but really there are only two things I have to make, and that's the peanut butter and tomato soup and the hermit cookie. Now the menu, along with the recipes, come from the cookbook School Lunches with Recipes to Serve 50 Children. That title, To Serve 50 Children, kind of reminds me of that Twilight Zone episode.
To serve men, it's a cookbook!
But I assure you there are no children used as ingredients in either of these recipes. Rather, they are recipes for a lot of food to feed a lot of little kids. And I don't have any little kids around here, so I'm going to be cutting down the recipes. I'm going to make half of the cookies and just a quarter of the soup, and that's still enough soup to fill the biggest pot that I own. And so to make that soup, what you'll need is one number 10 can of tomatoes. This is a number 10 can of tomatoes. It's huge. It is 6 pounds, 6 ounces, or about 2.9 kilograms. The original recipe calls for 4 of these, so 1 is enough. 2/3 of a cup, or 75 grams of flour, 1 1/3 cup, or 340 grams of smooth peanut butter. Crunchy peanut butter, which I prefer, had come on the market just a couple years previous, but I'm guessing they used smooth peanut butter especially because it is a soup. Also, try to get it with no sugar added, because they wouldn't have added a ton of sugar at the time. A 1/2 cup, or 55 grams of chopped onions, and 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt. Then the recipe says to press canned tomatoes through a sieve to remove the seeds. So I tried this and yeah, it didn't work, at least not for me. I'd say that my sieve was too fine, but any less fine and the seeds would have gone through, so that doesn't make any sense. And maybe they pureed it beforehand, so that's what I ended up doing. You know, you just kind of got to make it work, I guess. But once you get smooth tomatoes, mix a cup of it with the flour and the peanut butter until it is as smooth as you can get. Then add the onions and the remaining tomato into a large pot and heat it until it starts to boil. Take a bit of that hot tomato and add it to the peanut mixture, stirring it all together, and then add all of that into the pot with the rest of the tomato. Stir in the salt and then it says cook for about 10 minutes, stirring constantly. The cookbook gives options for 3 different cookies: oatmeal raisin, molasses, and hermits, which I had never heard of. I guess they're actually still eaten in New England, but I had never heard of them, and everyone who does know of them says that they're pretty good, so I figured I'd give them a shot. So for that, you'll need a bowl to sift in 180 grams of flour with a 1/4 cup or 35 grams of dried skim milk, a 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Then whisk everything together and add a 1/2 cup or 240 grams of chopped raisins and toss them into the flour mixture, coating them well. A lot of recipes for these call for currants, which are a little bit smaller, and it kind of makes sense because chopping raisins is rather tedious. Then cream together a 1/2 cup or 113 grams of butter with 3/4 of a cup or 160 grams of light brown sugar. Then add 2 beaten eggs and mix until smooth. Then add the flour mixture and gently mix until just combined. Then scoop the dough out onto baking sheets. And since we know that this will make 25 cookies, we'll know exactly how big the cookies would have been in 1934, and spoiler alert, they're a lot smaller than most modern cookies. But even so, bake them at 375 degrees Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius for 8 to 10 minutes or until they start to brown on top. And while they bake, make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, which if you think about it is a little bit like school lunch because 1, you learn how to make food, and 2, you get lessons like this one. So when that first school lunch happened is kind of hard to pin down. I mean, I'm sure somebody snuck some hummus and pita into one of Socrates' lectures. But when it comes to more of an organized school lunch, we have to look quite a bit later. Generally, it's accepted that it took place in Munich, Germany in 1790 when the American-born Benjamin Thompson, better known as Count Rumford, organized meals to be served to poor children before they took lessons. Though the children only spent half of the day in classes, they spent the other half making uniforms for the military, just like when I was in kindergarten. In France, school lunches started as gifts from private donors such as the author Victor Hugo, who sponsored an entire school. But in 1867, the Minister of Public Instruction, Victor Duruy, established the first widespread lunch program at over 460 schools. And a decade later, school canteens opened up all over Paris. And these were publicly funded programs that would give hot meals to all of the students. Those who could pay would, and those who couldn't got them for free. And even in the 1870s, the people setting this up knew that kids were bullies and would pick on those kids who got free lunches, and so they made a sort of ticket system so that everyone was anonymous. It was pretty cool. Similar programs came about in what's now Switzerland, Holland, and Germany, though in Germany, when a bill was introduced in the Reichstag in 1897 to provide school lunches in all cities, it was defeated because it was thought that free lunch would entice people to move into the already crowded cities. For a nationwide program, we must look to England, where the Parliament passed the Provision of Meals Act, which aims at securing that for this purpose, suitable meals shall be available just as much for those whose parents are in a position to pay as for those to whom food must be given free of cost. And the meals tended to be quite nice, always including some sort of dessert, like a gypsy tart, a Manchester tart, a treacle pudding, or spotted dick. And I'm assuming that the school children of England found the name just as funny as I did. Spotted dick. Now here in the good old US of A, it took us a little bit longer to get to a widespread lunch program, but there were local programs, like in 1853 when the Children's Aid Society of New York opened a vocational school for children living in poverty, and their attendance came with a meal. There were also penny lunches served in a handful of high schools in Philadelphia and Boston, and later in New York City there were 3 penny lunches because the cost of living in New York City is outrageous. But these programs didn't seem to take off. Most kids got their lunch by either going home at lunch and getting a meal there or bringing their lunch like I did when I was a kid. But the problem with that is that it leaves a lot of people out, i.e. all of the parents that aren't at home at lunch, or the parents who can't really afford to give their kid a meal to take to school. Then in 1904, Robert Hunter published a book called Poverty, which, among other things, pointed out that there must be thousands, very likely 60 or 70,000 children in New York City alone who often arrive at school hungry and unfitted to do well the work required. He asked what's the point of truancy laws, which had become pretty standard, making the kids go to school if they are too hungry to actually learn while they're there. Also, I do think it's kind of funny that Robert Hunter, who spent his entire life concerned with poverty in America, ended up living in Montecito, California, which now is maybe the least impoverished place in the whole country. I mean, that's like the home of Prince Harry and Oprah. But it was because of that book and others from the time that there was a newfound effort to feed America's children. By 1912, over 40 cities had lunch programs, often making lunches in central kitchens, then delivering them to schools around the cities. But for those living in rural areas, a lot of the cooking was left up to the teacher. Enter the 1916 book The Rural School Lunch by Nellie Wing Farnsworth. She was of the opinion that the rural children actually had even a greater need for a hearty lunch than their city-dwelling counterparts, because the main meal on the farm was the midday meal, and while they were in school, they weren't at the farm to actually get it. Also, she says that they would have been extra hungry because many had to walk upwards of 6 miles uphill both ways in the snow. And she basically actually says that, and that's always what my grandpa used to say. I thought that was kind of funny. Also, during the winter, it might be so cold that should a child bring their lunch carried in a basket or pail, it is often frozen. When the pail or basket is opened, it is found to contain cold pancakes, salt pork, cold potatoes, pie, and bottles of cold tea or coffee. Yes, coffee. It was not uncommon to give children coffee at the time, and I'm going to guess that a room full of over-caffeinated 8-year-olds really makes a teacher's job all that much harder. So it was determined that children should neither drink tea nor coffee, but milk, water, or cocoa. Even cocoa should not be served every day, as it provides a stimulant to many children. But since the kids were arriving at school with frozen food, it was actually up to the teacher to prepare a hot meal. This meant that they had to stock their classroom with, among other things, a 2-burner blue flame oil stove, a portable oven, a frying pan, kettles, egg beaters, and a 2-quart double boiler. Now that is a lot on a teacher's salary, but Miss Farnsworth had a solution. One rural school teacher had a shower. Like a baby shower, but for school lunch. She basically went to the stores in town and made up a list of all the things that she needed. She then sent invitations to all the mothers and women interested in the school, inviting them for a social afternoon and asking that each one bring with her one or more of the utensils which had been selected. And I would like to say that this is a relic of the past and how ridiculous, but since I come from a family of teachers, I know that it's not. Granted, it's not lunch and cooking items, but it is still like scissors and crayons and other things for the classroom that the teachers have to gather money to pay for. It's kind of ridiculous. Now, this book on rural school lunches really encourages that the kids eat together at a table rather than kind of going all over and eating, outside or whatever. This would encourage, among other things, better table manners. It would help their conversation skills, and my favorite reason, mothers will take more pains in putting up the lunch when they know that it is to be exhibited before the other pupils as well as the teacher. That is a mild public shaming to get mothers to send better quality lunches with their children. And so this was the status quo in the 19-teens and 20s, but then came the Great Depression. More children than ever were going hungry because their parents were all out of work, and so the parents couldn't afford the food that America's farmers were producing. So many problems, but one very elegant solution was school lunch. The New Deal allowed the federal government to buy up excess food from the country's farmers. Then they sent that food to school for children to eat, but instead of making the parents or teachers prepare the meal, they put those who were out of work into the kitchens, and thus was born the lunch lady.
It counts as a vegetable.
Now, one side effect of this program was that much of the food that the children began to eat was meat heavy, a lot more pork and beef, because it was those expensive ingredients that were in surplus. So our peanut butter and tomato soup was replaced with Salisbury steak.
Salisbury steak!
The American children were eating high on the hog, and then World War II happened. Surpluses turned into shortages, and schools were subject to the same rationing as everybody else. And the school lunch cookbooks from this period seem to include a lot of canned foods. It also saw just the actual number of school lunches really dwindle, and the effects of this were quickly evident. And so once the war was over, in 1946, Congress passed the National School Lunch Act, since, as President Harry S. Truman said, "No nation is any healthier than its children or more prosperous than its farmers." So with decent budgets available for school lunches and school lunch infrastructure, the 1950s and 60s saw the cafeteria become the standard model for handing out school lunches to students. It's also when classic school lunch foods like pizza, fish sticks, and mashed potatoes served via ice cream scoop became popular fare. Of course, with public funds came a lot of lobbying on how to spend those funds, and so how students ate was largely determined by what companies had the most influence in Washington. And so the 1970s saw chips and candy bars and vending machines make their way into the cafetoriums of America. Nutritional guidelines started to dip, and by the 1980s, they fell off a cliff. And this is the area that gives rise to the idea that America once considered ketchup a vegetable, which isn't actually true. It turns out that it was probably just something that somebody said in a meeting, maybe in jest, maybe not, but never actually became public policy. But even so, school lunch became increasingly privatized and the portions shrank, yet the calories grew, mostly due to just more added sugar. And that's why my mom always made me take my lunch to school, which was okay as long as I had a really cool lunchbox. But then Lunchables got really popular, and that was the cool thing to bring, and they didn't fit in my really cool lunchbox. So on those few occasions when I could convince my mom to spend money and buy me Lunchables, I had to decide between the Lunchables and the cool lunchbox, and usually I went with the Lunchables in a brown paper bag. These were the things that made me lose sleep when I was 8. But in recent years, it seems that the quality of the food in school lunches has actually started to go back up, and there has been a concerted effort to make them more nutritional. But I think that we're still quite a bit behind most other countries, especially France, who has like full-on meals for the kids with beef bourguignon and brie on freshly baked baguette. And they do it at a lower cost than we do. It's crazy. I don't know how they do it. But you know, I don't have any beef bourguignon today, nor fresh baguette, but I do have some peanut butter and tomato soup and hermit cookies, about ready to eat. So once your cookies are cooled, slap together a butter sandwich with Wonder Bread and you're all set. And here we are, school lunch from the Great Depression. So I gotta say the texture of this doesn't look particularly appetizing. It's kind of gloopy, but it smells good, so let's give it a try. Oh, those poor children. Honestly, it's not even that it tastes bad, because it doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good. I love tomato soup. I love peanut butter. Turns out those two flavors do not go well. They don't make a new flavor. It's more like tomato soup and peanut butter fighting against each other, and nobody wins. Hopefully the hermit cookie will be a little bit better. These smell really, really good. Let's give it a try. You can kind of tell from a cookie how it smells. Actually, that's really, really good. It reminds me of like the flavor of a fruit cake almost, but obviously not the texture. It's like a much softer, chewy texture. I've seen recipes where they kind of spread out more. It's probably just a different quantities of butter and everything in there, but this is more of a chewy cookie, which I really like. Delicious. A- to these. If they had chocolate in it, it would have been an A+. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. I'm gonna finish this right now. A few years ago, there was a trend online of people making water pie from the Great Depression. And so I decided that I wanted to try it, but when I went to look for the original recipe from the period, I couldn't find one. I did find some, but they were not from the Great Depression. So today I'm going to be making a water pie from 1908 and looking at the actual origin of this interesting dessert. So thank you to Our Place for sponsoring this video as I try my hand at water pie, this time on Tasting History. So the story that you'll see online is that water pie was invented during the Great Depression out of necessity. But if that was the case, you would think that there would be a recipe that had been printed in one of the many newspapers that was around at the time. They were printing pretty much every recipe that existed back then. But I couldn't find one. All that I could find when I searched were modern interpretations of what seems to be a dessert from a bygone era. Now that's not to say that the dessert did not exist at the time. It most surely did, because in 1982, a woman named Dolores Stone wrote in a newspaper asking people if they had a recipe for this pie that she remembers her grandmother making during the Depression. Last call for water pie recipe. Dolores Stone writes, back in 1936 in Cordell, Oklahoma, my grandmother made something called water pie for her 10 kids. It was made with sugar, water, and spices in a pie shell. I would love to hear from anyone who might know about this recipe. Now maybe someone reached out to Dolores with a recipe, and I sure hope for her sake that they did, because I looked through many cookbooks from this period and couldn't find anything called water pie. But that's not terribly surprising because, frankly, if you could afford a cookbook, then you could afford to make a regular custard pie, which this is a version of. But I was surprised that it also didn't exist in any of the tens of thousands of newspapers that I have access to through multiple online archives. It wasn't anywhere, so I was beginning to think that this is one of those recipes that just never left the kitchen recipe box. But just as I began to think that I was going to have to give up my quest to find a historic recipe, I came across a blog called History Reheated, where the author had the same dilemma that I was having, but she had it about a year ago, and she did find 2 recipes for water pie, but they were not from the Great Depression. In fact, they were from before the Great Depression, so that immediately debunks the idea that it was invented during the Depression. One recipe came in 1908 and another came in the 1880s, quite a bit before the Depression. And I'll be using bits of both to remake this pie, but I'm going to mostly be using the 1908 recipe, which comes from the Fulton Gazette in Fulton, Missouri. And it was sent in by a Mrs. Hollis Cruz as a submission to the newspaper's cooking contest and says, water pie, 1 cup sugar, 2 tablespoons of flour mixed well with sugar, then add 1/2 cup of hot water, lump of butter, and flavoring. Cook until it becomes thick, then pour into your prepared paste and bake slowly. So most of the ingredients are the same as what you'll usually find online, the modern interpretation, but what's different is that this recipe has you mix the ingredients and then cook them before putting them into the pie shell. The other modern interpretation usually has you just kind of add everything into the pie shell and then put butter on the top. And I guess it works as well, but that is kind of the major difference. Now, this is really supposed to be like a custard pie, and I know that because in an 1886 recipe, it says this is a good substitute for custard pie when milk is scarce. And so, just like I would with most custard pies, I'm going to blind bake the crust so it doesn't end up all soggy and gross at the end. As far as the pastry that I'm going to do, I am going to use a recipe from Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School cookbook, which was extremely popular in 1908, and she has several recipes for pastry. Most of them have either butter or lard or shortening. I'm going to do one that has butter and lard. Specifically 1/4 cup or 55 grams of lard or shortening, and 1/4 cup or 55 grams of butter. Then 1.5 cups or 180 grams of flour, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and some ice cold water. And the process to make this is slightly different than most pie crusts that I've ever made. It has you whisk together the flour and the salt, and then cut the lard into the flour with a knife or your fingertips, and then you add just a little bit of cold ice water, enough to make it come together into a dough. It took me about 3 tablespoons. And then put that dough onto a floured surface and knead it just a couple of times to bring it together, and then flatten it out and then put the butter, which should be cold, on top of the dough and fold it over and give it a few rolls with a rolling pin. I guess it's kind of like a rough puff pastry, but not exactly. Fold it over a couple more times while rolling, and that is it. There should still be pretty big chunks of butter left in the dough. And the recipe says it can be used straight away, or you can chill it, and I opted to chill mine in the refrigerator for 30 minutes before rolling it out and lining a pie dish with it, crimping the edges, and then poking some holes in the bottom, and then I lined it with aluminum foil, but you can use parchment as well, and fill it with baking beans. So you can blind bake it at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius for 15 minutes, then take it out of the oven, remove the hot baking beans, and return it to the oven and bake for another 5 or 6 minutes or until the bottom is pretty much done. And then you want to let the crust cool completely before you make your filling. And now let us make this pie filling, for which you will need 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar, 2 tablespoons of flour, 4 tablespoons or 55 grams of butter, 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of warm water. This is a little bit more than the 1908 recipe calls for and a little bit less than the 1880s recipe calls for, so I just kind of met in the middle and hope that that worked out. Also, the later recipe actually just says add flavoring, but it doesn't tell you what flavoring. The older recipe says it should be nutmeg, so I added that. I added a 1/4 teaspoon, but then I also added some vanilla, which was very popular in 1908. I added 1.5 teaspoons of that. I don't think it's bad to add both. You could probably add something else because I have a feeling this pie is going to be in desperate need of some flavor. So just mix the flour and the sugar together in a saucepan and then add the butter and the water and the flavorings and set it on the stove over a medium heat. After about a minute, the butter should melt and you can stir everything together, and then after a couple more minutes, it will begin to thicken up. This is all due to the sugar and the flour. The 1889 recipe actually also includes an egg, which would really make it more like a custard, but this recipe, no egg. Once your filling thickens, pour it directly into the cooled pie crust, and since my crust was much deeper than expected, I decided to make another batch of filling and add that in as well, especially since a lot of the liquid will evaporate off. But if you are using a pre-made pie crust that's kind of already in one of those little tins, 1 batch of filling should do. Then put the pie in the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius for 15 minutes, then drop the temperature to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius, and bake for another 45 minutes. Honestly, I do not know if that's enough because unlike a traditional custard with milk and eggs, which will set in the oven as it cooks, this remains liquidy, pretty much the same as it was when it went in, and it doesn't set until it cools. So how you know it's done is kind of a mystery, so hopefully that works. But after about an hour total, you can take it out and let it cool completely. It really does take about a half a day to cool. It does need to cool completely to firm up, but that gives us plenty of time to go back and look at some of the origins of water pie. So since these water pie recipes come from decades before the Great Depression, it is obvious that this pie was not invented during the Depression as a result of the hard times people were facing in the 1930s. But that doesn't mean that it didn't come from hard times. In fact, the Florida Agriculturalist in 1889 makes it very clear that that is precisely why this pie exists. The 1880s had this recipe kind of bouncing all over newspapers for about a decade, and in 1889 it is couched in kind of a conversation between 2 women who were trying to figure out ways to economically feed their family. "I skip all your recipes which call for cream and over 3 eggs, said our economical friend the other day as we seated ourselves in her cheery sitting room for a morning call. In the first place, downright cream is not to be had in these parts, and a pudding or pie with more than 3 eggs for an ordinary family is a sin." And she shook her head with such an air of positiveness that was meant to be convincing at least. "I have one here," said I am sure you will like. You see, it speaks for itself as economy. Cold water pie. 2 tablespoons of flour, level. 2 tablespoons of sugar, heaping. 1 egg, a small tablespoon of melted butter, nutmeg, and a good half pint of water. That will make 1 pie. "That sounds somewhat like it," she said, "and good, too. I used to make just such pies and custards when I first came to Florida over 20 years ago. It was almost before the days of condensed milk. At least it was very high in price. And as to getting a pint of milk from these fractious Florida cows was to pay pretty dearly for it. oh, we did have a hard time the first year or two. See, while the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression are what often comes to mind when we think of hard times in America, the country had actually had a series of smaller depressions in the decades leading up to it, including one called the Long Depression, which started with the Panic of 1873 following a post-Civil War speculative bubble, and that lasted until 1879, or by many accounts, 1899, since during those last 20 years they had a recession just about every year to 18 months. It was, after all, the Gilded Age, when a few uber-rich people at the top were doing just fine, and then everyone else was forced to make things like water pie. Another economic collapse took place just as the 1908 recipe was being printed, because that followed the Panic of 1907, when there was a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company, and that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System, but not before making life considerably harder for the majority of people in the country. Now, all of these paled in comparison with what would take place in the 1930s during the Great Depression, but people were having hard times long before that happened. So my question is, if people couldn't afford the ingredients to make a proper pie, then why did they feel the need to make a pie at all? I mean, I like pie, but I wouldn't call it essential, really, at least not today. But it turns out that around the turn of the 20th century, pie and other baked goods were rather essential for many people. In 1907, it was written that in no other country or at any other time has the demand for good baked stuffs been so great as it is at the present time in this country. The time has now come, whether it be in the home of the humblest workman or in the mansion of the rich, the cook or housewife is more praised and esteemed for her good bread, biscuits, pastries, and cakes than for anything else. See, unlike today, where pie is typically seen as an occasional treat, pies during the turn of the 20th century were often a staple of many Americans' diet. In 1899, the city of New York consumed 80 million full-sized pies a year, over 23 pies per person. And that doesn't count homemade pies, but just the manufactured pies that came from the 21 pie-making factories that surrounded the city. See, at that time, pie was on the level of steel and railroads. There was the Steel Trust and the Railroad Trust, and there was a burgeoning pie trust. A monopoly where one company, the American Pastry and Manufacturing Company, owned 19 of those pie-making factories that surrounded the city. Pies were held in such high esteem that there were articles condemning this pie trust, which threatened the diversity of this most important dish. The pie is an article of necessity in every household, as much so as the bed or the cooking stove. Other dishes have come and gone to suit the fickle whims of the public, but pie remains. It is hallowed by maternal associations and family memories. Its virtues have been celebrated by our best essayists and sung by our great poets. A trust in pie should be as abhorrent to the American people as a trust in family Bibles or family trees. The monopolists must keep their greedy hands off that good familiar creature. Makes you feel downright patriotic. But it turns out that even back then, pie had its detractors, and partly this was because it was associated with the working class, and it turns out that there were a bunch of pie snobs out there, like Rudyard Kipling, author of The Jungle Book. Surely he was influenced by the fact that in the UK, pies were also typically a food of the common people at this time. And so, when living in New England, he wrote that I live within the Great Pie Belt. It extends through the New England states and through northern New York. Pie is a habit all over the eastern states. In the West, it is a debauch. Have you ever considered the moral and physical condition of a people which eats pie for breakfast, pie for dinner, pie for supper? Snob and a half. But it was not only the foreigners who were condemning our American pie-eating habits, but also domestic authors. In 1902, a New York Times columnist, Kate Masterson, took the country to task in her article, The Great American Pie. Pie really is an American evil. It is not only notoriously unhealthy, but it lacks all those subtle distinctions which should mark all foods, especially the dessert. Persons fond of pie have a way of classing it as a diet rather than a dessert. Pie, however, cannot be taken seriously as a food. Of course, no dessert should be serious for that matter, but it ought to be palatable, piquant, delicate, and possessed of the psychic suggestion which is part of all properly composed dishes. She goes on to say that pie is immoral and puts it in a category with cigar smoke, paint, and turpentine. She says those that eat pie frequently are dyspeptic, and they gorge themselves at the cafeterias and pie bakeries of America. Pie eaters at a lunch counter are as hysterical and unmannerly as women at a bargain sale. They mass themselves and wedge solidly toward their magnet. The effect of pie are, like those of every other injurious food, insidious. No great man was ever fond of pie. No important work was ever consummated on a pie diet. Pie is a clog on the spirit and a ball and chain on the imagination. Wow, this lady really hates pie. Or at least that's what I thought at first, but it turns out that Kate Masterson, in addition to being a wonderful journalist, of which there were few female journalists at the period, she was also a satirist. And so she is actually not making fun of the pie eaters here. She is making fun of the people, the snobs, who look down on the pie eaters, because there were all these other articles, a little less hyperbolic, that were talking about poor people eating pie. They also often said that pie was just unhealthy because the amount of lard that was always put into the crust, and, you know, maybe they have a point. But unhealthy or not, I love a good piece of pie. So my only question is, am I about to have a good piece of pie or not? And here we are, water pie from 1908. I am actually quite shocked at how firmed up this is, considering that it's mostly water and sugar, you know. It is not the prettiest thing I've ever seen. The butter has like congealed on top. So that's what it is. But let's give it a taste. That'd be pretty good. It's actually really good. I'll have more. So you get a little, that nutmeg and the vanilla, that's the flavors. There's nothing else there, except for sugar, really. So I think whatever flavoring you add is very important with this. You know, you could add maybe lemon, kind of make a lemon meringue flavor, key lime or something like that, or another spice. I don't know. You could do a lot of different flavors with it, but that's what it is. It's a really great vessel for whatever flavor. I think the butter is very important. It does give it a richness. It's firm without being super firm. It's kind of like a custard, but a little bit softer. I think if it was cold, it would be even firmer. That's really good. So as the water kind of evaporated, it left like a caramel ring around the pie crust. And the crust itself is really good. Super flaky, super buttery. Yeah, I'm actually really surprised at how much I like this pie. Thanksgiving is just around the corner. So if you don't want to do your normal like pecan pie or pecan pumpkin pie, this would be a cool alternative. Actually, that's kind of the texture. Is the texture of the filling reminds me of the filling of a pecan pie. So if you like that texture, kind of gloopy but semi-firm, you like this pie. So maybe it doesn't come from the Great Depression, but it surely was popular during the Great Depression, I have no doubt. And maybe it can be popular again because it's pretty darn good, it's pretty darn easy, and yeah, you should make it. So enjoy your water pie, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. So for the last couple months, I've been doing a series on home front cooking during World War II, and I've covered several of the Allied countries, but today I'm going to be covering one of the Axis powers, Germany. And I'll be making a fennel and potato casserole that would have been eaten by the average German citizen during the war. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we try to survive on the German home front, this time on Tasting History. Today's recipe comes from the 1941 edition of the woman's magazine Frauenwarte, which was put out by the party in charge of Germany then, a party whose name I will not be saying in this video because of the YouTube algorithm. Now the recipe is for Fenchel Kartoffelauflauf, or fennel and potato casserole, and it says, if necessary, remove the outer leaves of the fennel bulbs and cut off the green ones. Then cut them and the raw peeled potatoes into slices. Layer them in a greased baking dish, alternating with salt and caraway and the finely chopped fennel greens. The top layer is potatoes. Pour the milk whisked with an egg and a tablespoon of yeast flakes over it, sprinkle with caraway and yeast flakes, and bake the casserole for about 1 hour. Serve with pickled beets or green salad. Now, since this recipe does come from fairly early on in the war, it reflects the fact that you were expected to still be able to get milk and eggs, which later on would be very difficult to come by. Even potatoes, the mainstay of the diet, at times were kind of hard to find. Later editions of the magazine have recipes that pretty much drop all things like butter and milk and really rely on vegetables and lesser cuts of meat or sausage. Like one recipe from December of 1943 called Billiges Abendbrot, or cheap dinner, which is basically just potatoes, onion, and sausage boiled with some brown gravy made from rye flour. Another thing you'll note is in those recipes, wheat flour is pretty much gone and replaced with rye flour and barley flour. And most of the dishes are a one-pot meal, or Eintopf, basically a stew of vegetables and inexpensive meat or sausage, if you could even find it. Eating this dish was something made popular even before the war with a campaign from the party called Eintopfsonntag, or Stew Sunday, which dictated that everyone should eat this inexpensive stew every Sunday. That same afternoon, members of the party would go around and forcibly collect money saved from making the dish, and then this was given to charity, a sort of compulsory donation freeing up the party to spend its funds on war preparations. When the war broke out, they changed the name to Opfersonntag, or Sacrifice Sunday, but it was essentially the same thing. A stew, albeit cheap, that could keep you nice and warm. For this recipe, what you'll need is a large bulb of fennel with the greens, 2 1/4 pound or 1 kilogram of potatoes. I used Yukon Gold because they do tend to hold their shape a little bit better than a starchy potato like a russet. About 1 1/3 cup or 330 milliliters of whole milk, 1 egg, a 1/4 cup or 30 grams of flour, 2 tablespoons of yeast flakes. You can find them here in the US, but here we call them nutritional yeast. Some caraway seeds and salt. Both the seeds and the salt are really to taste, but I used about 2 teaspoons of each. So first, wash and peel your potatoes and then slice them into rounds about 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick. Then soak them in some water for about 15 minutes. And while they soak, cut the fennel bulb from the stalks on the top, then slice it into 4 quarters and remove the center core. Then slice the fennel bulb into thin slices. As for the greens, strip them from the stalk and finely chop them. Then get a casserole dish and grease it with either butter or some other fat. Fats, including butter and margarine, were very hard to come by throughout the war, so use them sparingly. Then lay down a layer of the potatoes on the bottom of the dish, add a layer of the fennel bulb with the potatoes, and then generously sprinkle the top with salt and some of the caraway seeds. You can also use ground caraway. The recipe is not specific, but note that caraway is a strong flavor, so don't go overboard. Then add a sprinkle of the chopped fennel greens and repeat this layering of potato, fennel bulb, salt, caraway, and fennel greens, finishing with a layer of the potatoes on top. Then in a bowl, add the egg to the milk and whisk it until it is nice and smooth, and then add 1 tablespoon of the yeast flakes and stir those in. And here I made a decision that may not be correct, I'm not entirely sure, because the list of ingredients in the recipe includes flour, but the directions never mention flour again, so I'm not exactly sure where the flour is used. And I look at some modern versions of this, and they don't even use flour. So I added it to this mixture, but I'm not entirely sure that was right. Once everything is whisked in, pour it evenly over the dish, making sure to coat the potatoes. Then sprinkle more caraway on top, along with the other tablespoon of yeast flakes. Then cover it and set it in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius, and bake it for 1 hour. And you can take the lid off in that last 10 minutes just to let it brown a little bit on top. Now, as it bakes, I'd ask you to make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History if you're not already, as we delve into what the German people were eating on the home front during World War II. So I'm recording this after I actually recorded and edited the rest of the video that you're about to watch because I wanted to give a sort of disclaimer. I found it, in making this episode, very difficult to separate the people on the German home front who were not directly involved with the atrocities going on and the people who were directly involved in the atrocities going on. Partly because, involved or not, the people benefited from many of these atrocities, at least when it came to food. The Germans were eating relatively well most of the war because they were stealing food from many of the occupied countries. And while I will talk about some of those specific food-related atrocities, there are other atrocities that we know were taking place that I'm not going to be discussing in this video because they just don't have anything to do directly with the topic. So as you're watching, if I talk about something and you're like, well, there's a lot of context missing, know that I did my best to cover everything, but in a 20-minute video, it's just impossible to talk about absolutely everything. But I wanted to make this video because I do think, especially since I'm making a whole series on World War II homefront eating, you can't leave out Germany. So with that said, here's the history portion of this video. Rationing in Germany didn't technically start until the war began in 1939, but eating as if they were going to war began some years earlier. It's impossible to know exactly when, in the minds of the leaders, they knew that they were going to be starting a war, but by 1936, they were definitely making preparations. This was when the 4-year plan, an economic plan made to ready the country for war, was put into action. This included the rapid rearmament of Germany, which took many farmers away from the fields and brought them into better-paying manufacturing jobs. As Hermann Göring, who oversaw much of the plan, said in a speech, "Guns will make us powerful, butter will only make us fat." The irony here being that Göring was notorious for later on going to restaurants during rationing and eating an entire week's worth of rations for a normal citizen in one meal. But while guns are necessary for war, so is food, so is butter. And the fact that about 50% of the country's butter and margarine and almost all of their oils came from outside of the country, that was going to be a problem once they headed to war. So in 1939, Walter Darré, the Minister of Food and Agriculture, working with Herbert Backe, prepared the country's food supply for war. The plan was to make Germany completely self-sufficient, so they wouldn't have to rely on any other countries to feed their people. And this meant in 1939 there was a lot of stockpiling of food from those other countries. Supposedly, the preparations would work as long as the German food supply remained intact and the war was fairly short. But if the war was prolonged or there were any failed harvests, that wouldn't be great, and spoiler alert, both of those things happened, so Germany was going to then have to find other places to get their food from. But at the start, everything was to remain hunky-dory and the citizens were to be well fed. Because at the end of World War I, one of the reasons that Germany lost the war was an entire collapse of the food supply system. The winter of 1916 and 1917 was known as the turnip winter because turnips, the food generally fed to animals at the time, were about all there was to eat. And by the end of the war, even those were running low, and Germany's long-running boast that it couldn't be starved out no longer applied. This lack of food and military losses led to civil unrest, and the people turned against the Kaiser, and like that, the war was over. Now, obviously, it was much more complicated than that, but essentially, no food, low morale, bad for any war, and bad for the government. So, the new government was determined that this time, things would be different. So when the war finally broke out on September 1st, 1939, rationing went into effect, and citizens were given a set amount of butter, milk, cheese, fats, meat, sugar, and jam, and a few weeks later on September 25th, bread and eggs were added. Mondays and Fridays were also proclaimed meatless days, even for restaurants. But while the amount of these products were set, the German citizens were actually in many cases getting even more calories than they had been getting before the war. Of course, the diet was much more monotonous because it had to be all made of things grown at least inside of Europe. So anything imported like coffee or chocolate or bananas were all but impossible to get. As Ursula Mallendorf, who was a child in Germany during this period, later wrote, "Breakfast and supper at our house usually consisted of bread and marmalade or evil-tasting margarine. Dinners were monotonous. Most days we had Eintopf, a casserole of potatoes and various vegetables boiled in bouillon and thickened with flour." The rationing system was notoriously complex because, unlike the rationing that was done in Britain and the US, not everybody got the same amount. Industrial workers got a lot more food than many other people. Additionally, about a third of the country was not even part of the rationing system. A lot of people who lived in rural villages were considered self-sustaining. Basically, they had access to farm-grown food and everything, so they didn't need the guarantee of food from the government. Now, sometimes this meant that they actually ate a lot better than their city-dwelling counterparts, but sometimes it did not, because often the government would come in and take 100% of the food that had been grown, leaving them basically with nothing. There was also, of course, a segment of the population who was part of the rationing system, but were kept on near starvation amounts of food. These were, of course, the Jewish population, as well as the Poles, the Slavs, and prisoners of war that came into Germany for forced labor. But for the rest of the population, the average German citizen, they would be given a series of ration cards. Harry Flannery, an American journalist living in Berlin during the first years of the war, wrote that each card was a different color. There were blue cards for meat, yellow for fat and cheese, white for sugar and marmalade, green for eggs, orange for bread, pink for flour, rice, cream of wheat, oatmeal, tea and coffee substitutes, and purple for candy, nuts, and fruits. Now, even though, at least at first, there was enough food to go around, the system was a little bit clunky, so there were often shortages at certain locations, and pretty much everywhere there were long lines. And this led to some disgruntled people, both customers and shopkeepers alike. So Gertrud Schulz-Klink, the head of the Women's League, fashioned a series of 10 commandments that were posted in shops. These included things like 1. The shopping housewife shall not lose her temper if the article she wants doesn't happen to be in stock. 4. She shall not start racing from store to grab things just before closing time. Or 9. The shopkeeper will not show his personal sympathies and antipathies too plainly. As I mentioned before, this plan of making sure everyone had enough food was going to work as long as there were no poor harvests. But only 5 months into the war, there was a decidedly poor harvest of potatoes, basically the staple crop. It was due to bad weather. This was coupled with a labor shortage because 1.5 million people who had been working on the farms were drafted or else volunteered for the military. Harvests also continued to be poor due to a lack of equipment and nitrogen-rich fertilizer, as the raw materials were being diverted to the production of military equipment. But the government had a plan: take over more territory, and anything in those territories would be brought home for the German people. As Göring told the leaders of the occupied territories in a meeting in 1942, "If anyone has to go hungry, it shall not be the Germans, but other peoples." One stark example of this was in Greece, where nearly all of the country's food production, which was already beleaguered, was confiscated by the Wehrmacht and either eaten by them or sent back to Germany. And so during the winter of 1941 and 1942, 300,000 people starved to death. In the autumn of 1941, Greeks were living on just over 450 calories a day, and by winter it had dropped to 180, less than 2 slices of bread per day. One message from the island of Syros to the government in Athens simply said, "Send us either bread or coffins." Then, of course, there was, as I talked about in the video on the Soviet Union, der Hungerplan, or the Hunger Plan. This was a plan put in place during the invasion of the Soviet Union, whereby all of the food produced in places like Ukraine and Western Russia would be confiscated and sent back to Germany. And this did alleviate the German food shortages for a while. Elisabeth Dürr, who was living in Germany at this time, much later wrote, "This time we robbed the occupied countries, and our people did not have to go hungry until the end of the war." The invasion of other countries also addressed the labor shortage. POWs from places like Ukraine, Poland, France, and the Soviet Union were sent to live in rural Germany where they were forced to work on farms, though they did so on the near-starvation rations that I mentioned before. A Jewish Austrian, Edith Hahn, had been sent to Germany to work on an asparagus farm in 1942, and noted that it quickly became clear that the Germans were interested in using our strength, but not in preserving it. We were always ravenous, surrounded by bounty and aching with hunger. There were factions in the party that didn't condone this, though it wasn't because they were essentially committing war crimes, but rather because they did not like the fact that Germans, especially German women, were working that closely with people that they found inferior. And it really became a problem when there were reports that these people were living in their houses basically as family. But even with exploiting the POWs and taking food from the occupied territories, by the winter of 1942, the government was having trouble keeping its promise to have their citizens fed fully. And by the winter of 1943, people were eating 60% less meat, 20% less bread, and 40% less fat than they had been when the war began. And after one cut in the meat ration in 1943, the Ministry of Food released a statement saying the recent reduction, however painful it may have been to housewives, was inevitable. At any rate, whether we like it or not, we shall have to rely upon potatoes and vegetables for any improvement in our food position. The problem was that the meat and the potatoes were intrinsically linked. Before the war, pork and potatoes were the mainstay of the German diet. Both were ingredients that they had plenty of. But the potatoes were also the main food for the pigs. So when there was a potato shortage, it led to less pork. And with less pork available, the government had people eat more potatoes. This led to fewer potatoes, which led to fewer pigs, which led to fewer potatoes, and it was a vicious cycle until there really weren't enough of either. But even with the food shortages, the German people were actually still eating far better than most of the people in Europe at the time. But that was not to last. Because in 1944, with the Russians retaking much of the land in the east, and with the Allied invasion in the west well underway, Germany really did have to become self-sufficient for their food. But when British and American bombers began targeting the storage facilities and transportation systems in Germany itself, the country's ability to produce and distribute food was crippled. And it was around this time that the rationing system began to collapse. So when you would take your ration card into a shop, they wouldn't honor it. They didn't have any food to give you. So people relied more on the gardens that they were growing, similar to the Victory Gardens in England and America, or the food that they were raising. People were raising things like chickens and rabbits in their apartments or on their balconies. In cities, markets often had to replace their vegetables with things like the tops of sugar beets and nettles, and they would still charge way too much for them. And the government encouraged teachers to take their children out into the fields and scrounge for weeds and roots and other edible grasses. In the final days of the war, in 1945, the even meager food supply that there was pretty much dried up. A Frenchman who had been sent as a forced laborer to live in Berlin wrote about the city becoming surrounded by the Russians. We were in the middle of the battlefield. All around us and up in the sky, the war was raging. We just had one concern: eating. The daily soup was no longer being distributed, and everyone had to find their own food. Oddly enough, in the west and south of Germany, there were often towns that the Allies would enter, and they would have abundant food supplies, as if the war had never happened. So I guess how you ate in Germany at this time really depended on where you were. And so I'm curious, maybe in the south and the west, people were still able to make dishes like this fennel and potato casserole, which I'm about ready to eat. And here we are. Fenchel Kartoffelauflauf from the World War II German home front. So the original recipe says that it should be served with either pickled beets or green salad. I chose beets, though I couldn't find like large pickled beets. All I could find were these baby beets, which were cute. It's really good. I love pickled beets. As for the casserole, here we go. that flavor of caraway really hits you. So caraway and fennel both have this slight anise flavor. They have other flavors there too, but they do both have that kind of licoricey flavor, which I'm not a huge fan of, though I do like fennel. But that is the overwhelming flavor. There's not much else to it. The potatoes don't really taste. They're just there for texture and to fill you up. So you're getting the flavor of the fennel and the caraway. What this needs, because it is kind of dry. It's not too dry, like it's palatable, but what it needs is cheese. I think today if you made it, you put some cheese on there and it would be an absolutely wonderful dish, or just some more milk or maybe heavy cream, something to just kind of give it a little bit more moisture. That said, the flavor is pretty good, especially if you do like that flavor. And, you know, if you're eating this during wartime, you wouldn't notice a huge difference in how you were eating from the before times, I would think. Later on, things did get different, but the recipes, at least, were like, everything is fine. One more interesting thing that I found while I was doing research was a propaganda film from 1941 called The English Disease, and it was about rickets, a disease that often children get, and it's all about how to make it so your children don't get this disease. It says give them lots of fresh air and sunlight, and a diet rich in vitamins is also a great value for the child's healthy development. Grated raw carrots, spinach, and lettuce are especially important for a young child. But it's why they called it the English disease that I found interesting. See, the video claimed that during World War I, the British government intentionally caused an epidemic of rickets in Germany. How exactly they did that, they do not say, but they do say that because of that, during this war, it is imperative that the English disease can never become a German disease. So eat your veggies, get some sunlight, don't get rickets, and make sure if you haven't, watch the other videos in the series on the US, the UK, and the USSR. I have at least one more in this series, going to be on Japan, and actually another British video coming up. So yeah, and I will see you next time. During Christmas time, it is easy to get carried away and overspend. But during the Great Depression in the 1930s, overspending wasn't even an option. So to save money, people had to get creative with their gifts, their decorations, and even their food, with dishes like this 1931 recipe for an inexpensive Christmas pudding. This time on Tasting History. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a fictional radio character known as Aunt Sammy. She was supposedly the wife of Uncle Sam, and she would teach people how to cook and give recipes over the radio. And in December of 1931, she told her audience that a less expensive dinner for a thrifty Christmas can be just as good and just as Christmassy as one planned with all the frills and expensive items of food. She then goes on to give an entire inexpensive menu for a full Christmas dinner, an important thing to have in 1931, as most of the country, in fact most of the world, was in the depths of the Great Depression. Many people relied on soup kitchens and food drives during this time, but provided you were fortunate enough to be able to afford a full home-cooked meal for Christmas, then this menu could at least help with pinching the pennies. The first course was a hot tomato bouillon or cocktail with chopped parsley sprinkled on top, a festive mix of red and green. Then there's a main course of baked smoked ham, buttered cauliflower, creamed spinach, candied sweet potatoes, celery, cranberry sauce, and pickles, all with recipes that make the dishes less expensive than they would traditionally be. But it's the dessert that really intrigues me, because it is for a chocolate plum pudding. But instead of being the old-fashioned, steaming hot plum pudding, is made with gelatin and served cold with whipped cream. So that's what I'm going to make, and it requires 2 tablespoons of granulated gelatin, 1 cup or 235 milliliters of cold water, 1 pint or 475 milliliters of milk, 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar, 1.5 ounces or 45 grams of unsweetened chocolate, 1 teaspoon of salt, a half teaspoon of vanilla, 1 cup or 150 grams of raisins, 3/4 of a cup or 100 grams of chopped dates, a half cup or 60 grams of chopped nuts, a half cup or 70 grams of dried currants, and 3 egg whites. You also need some either walnut or pecan halves and some raisins for decorating the pudding. Now, I'm not exactly sure how this is less expensive than a traditional pudding, or at least much less expensive. It is missing a few of the spices, but by this time, spices weren't all that expensive, so I'm not exactly sure. But If I learned anything from watching Mickey's Christmas Carol when I was a little kid, then I learned that time is money. So perhaps this is a less expensive pudding simply because it takes a lot less time to make than a boiled or steamed pudding. Now when Aunt Sammy introduced America to this inexpensive Christmas pudding, she read out the entire recipe on the radio. And it's so well written that I can pretty much just say what she said as we walk through the recipe. She says, to make this pudding, first soften the gelatin in the cold water for 10 minutes. While the gelatin is soaking, melt the chocolate with part of the sugar. She's not specific with how much sugar, so I just added a couple tablespoons. Then she says, when it is melted, add a little of the milk, just enough to make a smooth paste. Then in a different pot, heat up the rest of the milk until it is steaming, and when the milk is hot, add it to the melted chocolate, then the sugar and salt, and finally the soaked gelatin. Stir the mixture, then remove it from the fire. Set it away to grow cold. And you can do this by either leaving it out to cool down slowly, or to speed things up, put it in the refrigerator, but keep a close eye on it because you don't want it to fully solidify. You want to catch it just as it's starting to thicken up. When it begins to thicken, add the vanilla, the fruit, and the chopped nut meats. Mix all of this in, and then in a clean bowl, beat the egg whites until you have nice stiff peaks. Then fold in the beaten egg whites. Then she has you prepare a pudding mold, and these can be all sorts of different things, but the traditional Christmas plum pudding style is basically just a bowl. It's a pudding basin. It's a bowl with a slightly flat bottom. So pick something like that, wet the inside, and then line the bottom with the walnut or pecan halves as well as the additional raisins. Then pour the pudding mixture into the mold and smooth the top. Then set it in the fridge to fully firm up before serving, and while it firms up, we can look at just how Christmas was celebrated during the Great Depression. The Great Depression came in the aftermath of the stock market crash in 1929. It actually took several years for it to hit its lowest point, and then it lasted throughout the 1930s. And while it hit some people harder than others, few went untouched, and generally the entire decade was rather bleak. And because of this, it was really important for people to celebrate those things that did bring them joy, like Christmas. Christmas was such a big thing to us. The bell on Christmas Eve, the candles on the tree, that's what I remember. I don't remember the sadness of my parents. We loved books, we loved music, and we made Christmas cards of beautiful little tissue paper baskets. And that was a common thing during this period, making your own Christmas. You'd make your own gifts, you'd make Christmas cards, and even the decorations. It was common to decorate the Christmas tree with garlands made of cut paper and strings of popcorn and cranberries, though some opted for these slightly more expensive tinsel icicles that we were still using when I was a kid. And my mother hated those things. They would get caught in the vacuum cleaner and break it, and they would get dragged all over the house, so she was still finding them in July. Finally, we stopped using them. Of course, when I was a kid, they were made of a very different material than back in the 1930s. Originally, they were actually made of silver, but that would tarnish very quickly, so they switched over to lead, which didn't tarnish. Poisoned you, but it didn't tarnish. Lead was actually the go-to for tinsel up until the 1960s. This was also the period that candles on the tree, a major fire hazard, really started to go out of fashion. It was partly because it's really dangerous, but also because as part of the New Deal, the US government started its Rural Electrification Act, and this put a lot of people to work extending the power grid to much of the country that had yet to receive it, and with that, instead of candles, you could string lights on your tree. Of course, they also got incredibly hot, much hotter than they do today, and they did start a lot of fires, but probably less fires than the candles. Another semi-do-it-yourself Christmas decoration were called putz houses, and these were little houses and buildings that were made out of cardboard, and they'd usually put them under the tree or out in some other place and make a little Christmas village. And eventually these turned into the ceramic Christmas villages, which are still popular today. I am a personal collector of the Charles Dickens themed sets. Now, when it came to Christmas presents, a lot of things were homemade, and if they were purchased, they really needed to be practical for most people. There was one man who was raised by a single mother during the Depression who recalled that he got no toys. Maybe a couple pairs of socks, but nothing you could really play with. And no Christmas tree. We'd have burned that for heat in the pot-bellied stove. You couldn't get angry about it. In your heart, you knew the lady was doing the best she could. And she always made sure we had a decent dinner. She was a very strong woman, and we realized she was having a rough go. It'd just tear you apart, really. One woman who grew up in Brooklyn during the Depression recalled getting the same doll every year for Christmas, but her mother would make sure that the doll at least had a new set of clothes. I knew it was an old doll because it never had any bloomers. My mother couldn't make bloomers. I never let my mother know I knew. Perhaps the most iconic gift of the Great Depression was food itself, specifically oranges. Oranges were not a new thing to find stuffed in the bottom of a Christmas stocking, but it was very popular during the Depression because many people couldn't afford citrus for most of the year, so it was a real treat. My Nana, who grew up in New York City in the 1930s, always told me about how excited they were to get nuts and an orange in their stocking. And she actually continued that tradition. She would put it in my mom and aunt's stockings, and then our stockings when we were kids. And now my mom actually continues the tradition, putting an orange in my niece's stockings. I don't think it is as exciting as it was in the 1930s, but I still love that the tradition is continuing. There's actually a child's letter that I found from 1931, and it's a letter to Santa, and it kind of gives you an idea of what a kid during this time could expect to get for presents. Dear Santa, I thought as Christmas is not so very long off, I had better write you. I want you to please bring me a string of beads and a ring. Also, bring me lots of fruits, nuts, and candy. Don't forget the orphans and my little friend Dave. I think he wants a billy goat, a wagon, and a pair of pajamas so he won't get cold. I'm very curious if Dave ever got his billy goat. Now, while there were a lot of homemade gifts at this time, there were also a lot of toys and games for purchase that became super popular during the Depression if you could afford them. Things like the yo-yo, which had actually been around for thousands of years, had a boost in popularity with the introduction of the iconic Duncan yo-yo in the 1930s. Board games like Chinese checkers and Sorry were all the rage, and in 1935, Monopoly became the must-have gift for all ages. And I do find it somewhat ironic that one of the most popular games at the time was Monopoly during the Great Depression. Yin and yang. This was also the decade of the Little Orphan Annie toys, and Little Lulu and Betsy Wetsy dolls were popular. And perhaps the most coveted doll for any little girl was the Shirley Temple doll. She was so famous during this period, so her doll was on a lot of people's wish list. Though her fame actually kind of ruined some of her own Christmas innocence in 1934. I stopped believing in Santa Claus when I was 6. Mother took me to see him in a department store, and he asked for my autograph. Shopping for Christmas gifts like these dolls and board games was actually kind of part of the recovery effort for the economy. And in 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt actually moved Thanksgiving up a week to the second to the last Thursday in November, just to give people 7 more days of Christmas shopping, hoping that it might give an extra boost to the economy. Though the change didn't seem to really do much for the economy, but it did make a lot of people mad because, people don't like change, and so it was derisively often called Franksgiving. But even without the additional week of Christmas shopping, stores like Sears and Macy's did much of their business throughout the month of December, and at least in Macy's, this led to a new department which employed thousands of people every year, and that was the gift wrapping department. Scotch tape was introduced in 1930, and there were big advancements in the technology of printed paper that was not super expensive. And so this led Macy's every year to hire an army of women at $14 a week to wrap the gifts. Now, even then, $14 a week was not a lot of money, but it was enough money that it would allow the people to buy some Christmas gifts and make a good Christmas dinner for their family. We always had a big meal. We might have soup for a couple days before Christmas, but my parents thought it was important to keep the tradition of having something special. Other Christmas traditions, many of which could be done on the cheap, that got popular during the Great Depression were things like ice skating in front of Rockefeller Center, the rink being opened on Christmas Day 1936. And from there you could look up and see the iconic Christmas tree which they started putting up in 1931. And in 1933, just down the street at Radio City Music Hall, the Rockettes began the tradition of the Radio City Christmas Spectacular. And you could get tickets for as little as 35 cents, though if you couldn't even afford that, you could at least listen to a bunch of Christmas music on the radio, because this decade gave us a lot of the Christmas music that we still listen to today. Things like Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Winter Wonderland, and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, except it wasn't actually in song form yet. That took place in the 1940s. At first, it was just a storybook, written as part of a marketing campaign for the retailer Montgomery Ward. But But if you'd been hit especially hard by the economic downturn and couldn't afford tickets to Radio City or the Rudolph book, well, that doesn't mean that you couldn't still have a Merry Christmas. One of my favorite things that I found while researching this episode was actually a Christmas card, a homemade Christmas card from the Pinheiro family of Chicago. It's from the Christmas of 1933, and they made it out of cut-up brown paper bags, and on it they wrote a poem, and it really conveys how people were feeling during the holidays at this time. In days gone by, when we were broke, we hated to reveal it. In fact, our pride demanded that we struggled to conceal it. But now at last we're right in style and need not fear confession. We shrug and smile and say, oh well, it's merely this depression. And so this card, which once we'd scorn, now seems within all reason. It's cheap, and yet it brings to you best wishes of the season. And so it was all about finding something inexpensive that could still provide the warmth of the holiday season. Whether it was a homemade Christmas card, popcorn on the tree, or an inexpensive recipe for a Christmas pudding. So once the pudding is firmed up, dip it into some simmering water and/or wrap it in a hot towel to loosen it from the bowl, and then you can release it onto a serving plate. Aunt Sammy then says to serve the pudding with whipped cream, sweetened and flavored with vanilla, or with a currant jelly sauce. I opted for the whipped cream, which just needs a cup of heavy whipping cream along with a quarter cup of powdered sugar and a teaspoon of vanilla. Whisk it all together until you have lovely thick whipped cream, which can be piped around the pudding. And here we are, an inexpensive alternative to Christmas pudding from the Great Depression. So you can tell right away it's a very different texture than a boiled or steamed Christmas pudding. I mean, look at that wobble. I cut a piece out and it holds together. It's nice and firm. So let's give it a try. It is more firm than like pudding. It's almost like, well, it's a little gelatinous. That's really good. The flavor is really, really nice. You can taste the chocolate, you can taste the fruit. I really, really like it. I did just realize there are uncooked egg whites in it, to which I am somewhat allergic. So my mouth has gone a bit numb. I'm gonna be fine, but I'm not gonna have any more. Really need to pay better attention to that. The flavor is great. The texture, I wish it was a little smoother maybe. And I don't really know what you could do to achieve that and still have it hold together. I think to get the shape of it to hold, you do have to use that much gelatin. So it's not like pudding like we think of pudding here in the US today that's really smooth. It is a little more firm, more like a jelly mold, but much better tasting. So I hope everyone is able to celebrate a wonderful holiday season this year. Make some wonderful Christmas foods. It's my favorite time of year for cooking, baking, just in general. So yeah, I am going to go take some Benadryl, and I will see you next time